UK over the next day or so, chiefly affecting those northern parts.
Qatar Airways, world's 5-star airline.
From local traders to international finance, it's commerce that makes the world go round. For global companies and developing markets, communication is the currency, and information is the most valuable commodity. Counting the cost at this time on Al Jazeera.
It's filled with surprises, yet with a touch of the familiar. It's all those things you imagined, and some you didn't. It intrigues and fascinates, and often delights. It's a story of the world, and it's one with many endings. The 5-star global network, fly to over 90 destinations on board one of the world's youngest fleets. Qatar Airways, world's 5-star airline.
New pictures of the violent demonstrations in Egypt show protesters on both sides suffered brutal attacks. You're watching Al Jazeera live from Doha. I'm Nick Clark. President Mubarak's new cabinet has held its first full meeting as protesters continue to demand his resignation. On day 14, thousands of pro-democracy supporters held a symbolic funeral for journalists killed during the clashes. In other news, it's official. Southern Sudan will break away from the north following overwhelming support. And WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has appeared in court to fight extradition to Sweden. The US President Barack Obama says progress is being made between the Egyptian government and pro-democracy protesters, but thousands of people disagree, with many still on the streets calling for Hosni Mubarak to go. Meanwhile, as those protesters stake out the square, video has emerged of some of the most extreme violence in the capital last week. Andrew Simmons has more from Cairo. I should just warn you, his report contains graphic images which may be disturbing.
A crowd of anti-government protesters surrounding a pro-Mubarak supporters bus that had driven at speed into their number earlier. It's late last Wednesday night. They try to turn the vehicle over, ripping open the driver's door. There's no escape. Here, the driver's already been pulled out, and he's being lynched. From these pictures, it appears no one else was on the bus, but we can't verify that, and the fate of the driver is unknown. The frenzy of anger continues right through the night into the early hours of Thursday. Across the bridge, pro-Mubarak supporters on the move again, seemingly intent on more confrontation. But it all goes wrong. A mob of anti-government protesters swelling in numbers and showing no mercy. Each of the 9 men are attacked. Revenge for the earlier violence in which many of their numbers were killed, hatred. While some of the men are led away, beaten as they go, another was singled out. It hasn't been possible to establish how many victims of this night lived or died. This was all filmed by a European cameraman. He says 14 minutes later, there was yet another dimension to the violence. Gunfire on the bridge aimed at anti-government protesters. A laser picks out individuals. This round finds its target. It can't be established at this stage who fired these shots, just as it isn't possible to identify victims or their attackers. The questions over last Wednesday night, Thursday morning, linger. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
Well, despite the volatility, President Hosni Mubarak has held his first full meeting with his new cabinet. Meanwhile, people on the streets have held a symbolic funeral for a journalist killed during the clashes. Al Jazeera's Alan Fisher has the details.
It was a tribute to a dead journalist, shot doing his job. Ahmed Mahmoud was filming fights between protesters and police on his mobile phone. He was shot in the head. The coffin is empty. His body has yet to be returned to his family. But the emotion and the pain is raw and real.
I feel like I lost a great thing. I lost my partner, I lost my daughter's father, and she needs him.
Cairo is slowly cranking back up to normal. President Hosni Mubarak has held the first full meeting of his new cabinet, sending a clear message he's still in charge. On the streets, shops are opening, banks are functioning, traffic is moving.
The past 7-8 days affected the entire country. The banks were closed, the post offices were not open either. When they reopened yesterday, everything was back to normal, but there are still some queues.
The protest in Liberation Square is now moving into its third week. The people here are getting more organised. The numbers stay the same. The space they're allowed to occupy is getting smaller. Slowly, the army is squeezing the area around the square.
Those who are thinking that we will get tired of sitting in Tahrir Square, we tell them that we are not leaving. Mubarak should leave Cairo.
For the anti-government camp, the worry is the air is being sucked out of these protests, momentum is being lost. The tanks and soldiers are a reminder of what has gone on over the past days and weeks, and a reminder that this crisis is also far from over. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera.
All right, let's get some perspective on where we are right now. Dr. Lala Khalili is a senior lecturer in Middle East politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Joining us now from London. Dr. Khalili, welcome to the programme. I just want to go back to those images of violence that we saw a little bit earlier. They just demonstrate, don't they, the real depth and intensity of anger and hatred that there is out in the streets. It's lurking just beneath the surface right now.
Well, I think the anger and the hatred, really, the extraordinary amount of violence was primarily wielded by the pro-Mubarak thugs. I mean, it's important to remember that those demonstrations were all incredibly peaceful until the Interior Ministry and Mubarak's various functionaries actually sent out those thugs onto the street. And it's also important to remember that those people actually had weapons that the anti-Mubarak, the pro-democracy protesters in Tahrir Square didn't have. The fact that, for example, some of the protesters, the pro-democracy protesters, were actually shot by snipers, or indeed the Al-Ahram reporter whose symbolic funeral was held today, was shot in the head by a sniper, tells us that the anti-protester, that the pro-Mubarak thugs were actually directed. So I don't think that this is necessarily some sort of a generalized hatred. I think that this is actually an orchestrated violence by pro-Mubarak forces in order to, in some senses, show that Mubarak is there to, for example, keep security. Mubarak or his VP, Omar Suleiman, are there to keep security. And I think this is really important to emphasize. Okay. This is not generalized mob violence.
All right, well, let's move on to the current strategy that appears to be a strategy anyway of attempting to lay siege to the protesters in a sense that the government will just exhaust them into retiring, into giving up. And in a sense, it's a winning strategy, isn't it? Because how can the protesters answer that?
On the one hand, yeah, it is. There is a certain logic in this. You can exhaust the protesters for 6 months or however long, and perhaps get them to tire of this. And I certainly think that the protesters, certainly the leadership of the protesters, who are thinking about this, I'm sure that they are contemplating strategies on how to challenge this. Whether it's better to, for some number of the protesters, for some segment of them, to start marching on the streets, to do disruptive demonstrations or not. But it's also important to remember.
Could regain the initiative then? How do you think they could? Should they storm the presidential palace? What should they do?
Well, certainly storming symbolic buildings, whether it's the Bastille or presidential palace, usually tends to be extremely effective revolutionary measures. But it's also important to remember that the Tahrir Square is actually quite a significant place, and they can't simply push them out and squeeze them in a corner, because Tahrir Square has two things around it which are of great significance, among others. One is the Mugamma, which is a big bureaucracy building. It's the crescent-shaped building on one side, without which essentially most of Egyptian government bureaucracy wouldn't function. The second is the Egyptian Museum. So if the tourists want to return, or if people want to interact with the state, they would have to go through Tahrir Square. So in a sense, hanging on to Tahrir Square is actually quite a good strategy. I just think that in order for the protesters for the protests not to stagnate, there are probably going to have to be some supplementary forms of protest, which I think is actually going on, although we don't hear about it. For example, there are demonstrations going on in all the other cities, but also also importantly, there's stuff going on in northern Sinai, which you only hear hints about. Rocket fire towards the wall from the Egyptian, the wall separating Gaza and Egypt from the Egyptian side, or the blowing up of the pipeline that carries gas to Israel and Jordan. And I think these are also moments that are happening, and it's important to pay attention to those as well.
Right. Who knows which way this is going to turn, Dr. Khalili? We appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
Yes, my pleasure.
It is a historic day for Sudan, and